First of all, it is a great honor to be here. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about my great-uncle, Harry Bockner, as part of your school's Remembrance Day ceremonies. Harry was my grandmother's youngest brother. He was born right here in Guelph, Ontario on November 27, 1911. His family had left a small village outside of Lemberg, Austria around 1900. They later moved to Toronto, where Harry attended public school and high school. I've spent the past 25 years researching Harry's military service as the sergeant of an anti-aircraft gun crew in Italy and the Netherlands. Most people do not know very much about their relatives' military service in World War II. My grandmother, whom I was very close with, never spoke about her younger brother. There were two framed pictures of Harry in my grandparents' apartment. One, a dashing soldier in uniform. The other, his grave. Fortunately, I had some help. Harry was a prolific letter writer. He rarely missed a day. And fortunately, all of those letters were preserved. In the 1990s, I was helping my grandfather sort through his basement storage locker when I came across a number of large boxes. I opened them. They contained numerous letters. My grandfather said they had been written by Harry during his time overseas. He asked me if I wanted them. I took them home. One day I started reading them. By my count, there were well over 1,000 letters. I couldn't put them down. They contained a treasure trove of information. They were highly entertaining, at times funny, at other times very disturbing. Harry's letters got darker as the war progressed, alluding to the daily hell that he and his fellow soldiers endured. The constant noise, the cold, the wet, and the pervasive stench of death. As the Canadian soldiers fought their way through the mountains of northern Italy, Harry scrounged to find food and shelter for his men. They went months without showering. The letters were also quite profound. They told the story of a man who had come to a much deeper understanding about his own life under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. By the time I made my way through all of the letters, which I dutifully transcribed given their age, I felt like I knew the man. I shared the letters with my brother as I was going through them. We were hooked and wanted to know more. That set us off on a 2.5-decade odyssey. By the late 1990s, there were only a few relatives still alive who knew Harry. Fortunately, one of them, an elderly cousin, knew him well and was more than willing to talk. Harry dropped out of high school at the age of 16 and went to work in the fur business. According to our cousin, who ran around town with him in those days, Harry was the life of the party, including the ones he had not been invited to. He would arrive in a top hat, sit down at the piano, and sing and dance the night away. On September 30th, 1941, at the rather advanced age of 30, Harry enlisted with the 30th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery, which was headed up by Major Conn Smythe, a decorated soldier and legendary Toronto sports figure. Smythe owned the Toronto Maple Leafs and built their original home, Maple Leaf Gardens. I gathered as much public information as I could, securing Harry's military records from Ottawa. I was also able to track down Harry's unit war diaries. Over a period of time, I retraced Harry's steps, from his initial training at Petawawa, Ontario, to Vancouver Island, England, Italy, and finally to the Netherlands. But there was one key element missing. I wanted to find soldiers who actually knew him. Given the strict privacy rules, we quickly exhausted all potential leads through the public records. Somewhat desperate and running out of time, I had one last idea. In January 2005, I placed an ad in the Lost Trails section of the Legion magazine, asking if anyone remembered Harry Bockner, and provided my contact information. Sure enough, 3 months later, I received an email from a gentleman in Victoria. He said his father-in-law had seen the ad and asked him to contact me. It turned out he had been with Harry since 1944, right up until the day he was killed. I was floored. A couple of days later, I went out to get the mail and found 4 additional letters. One from a soldier who had received instruction from Harry in Italy on how to fire his anti-aircraft gun. He related a very funny story about Harry telling off a higher-ranking soldier who tried unsuccessfully to interfere in their training session. Another was from a member of Harry's anti-aircraft battery who had also been with Harry the day he died. He provided incredibly specific details about the circumstances surrounding Harry's death. Another was a beautifully written, heartfelt letter from a man in Gravenhurst, Ontario named Gil Hunter. Gil and Harry had enlisted in Toronto around the same time. They were both sent out west together for early training, but soon Gil was transferred to another unit. Harry and Gil met up again in Italy in 1944 during a large convoy. They spent a lot of time talking, catching up on the intervening years that they had been overseas. They both ended up in the Netherlands for the final push of the war. Not long after, on April 11, 1945, Gil heard over the radio that Harry had been killed. He rushed to the scene just as they were sewing Harry up in his blanket and helped load his body onto the truck that transported him to his temporary burial site. Gil related to me in his letter that he had visited Harry's grave twice while on trips back to the Netherlands and enclosed a copy of pictures of Harry's final resting place. It was incredibly touching. Based on the information supplied by Harry's fellow soldiers and the official historical records, I was able to piece together the story of what happened on that fateful day. Operation Cannon Shot was launched at 1600 hours on April 11, 1945. The soldiers of the 1st Canadian Division were tasked with crossing the Isle River, cutting the retreating German army in half, then pushing west towards the city of Apeldoorn. The driver of Harry's gun crew, Jim Moore, was ordered to cross a newly built pontoon bridge over the river. He came under heavy mortar fire. Harry ran onto the bridge and helped him go back. They then took shelter in a nearby barn where they were joined by the rest of the crew. A few minutes later, Jim was once again ordered to cross the bridge. Again he came under fire and retreated to the same barn. At 1700 hours, a mortar exploded over the barn. Harry took a direct hit to the head from the shrapnel, killing him instantly. On March 2007, I traveled to the Netherlands for Discovery Channel Canada. I was directing a documentary series at the time. While there, I had one day off, so I took our van and drove from Amsterdam to Zutphen in search of the exact place where Harry was killed. After several unsuccessful attempts at finding someone who could point me in the right direction, I spotted a man carrying a large bag. I pulled over and flagged him down. He spoke perfect English. I told him why I was there, and he said, "Come with me. I know exactly where you need to go." Turned out he was the mailman, and the place I was looking for was on his route. We arrived at a home in Gorsel near the water. I knocked on the door. A woman answered. I told her my story. She said that her father, who had been a young boy at the time, had spoken many times about that day. She then said, "Wait a minute, he's here, let me get him." Her father, Johann Walters, by now an elderly gentleman, gave me a warm greeting. It turned out his family had taken shelter in the basement of their house in order to escape the shelling. The house caught fire, so they ran to a nearby shed. Along the way, Johann saw Harry's body being carried out of the barn. He still distinctly remembered Harry's fatal head injury. He then disappeared and returned a few minutes later carrying a painting of the barn, and he told me that their current home was located where the barn had formerly stood. As time went on, I kept thinking about one of Harry's former mates, Jim Moore, who had answered my ad in the Legion. I occasionally emailed his son-in-law. I was very aware of the fact that I was running out of time. So in January 2014, I flew off to Chase, British Columbia with a cameraman colleague of mine to interview Jim Moore. 91 and sharp as a tack, Jim had been Harry's driver since meeting up with him at Ortona, Italy in January 1941. Jim had never spoken about the war, but over the course of a couple of days, the memories came pouring out. It turns out Harry had been a father figure to Jim and his younger fellow soldiers. My search was almost complete, or so I thought. Sometime just after Remembrance Day in 2019, I was searching the internet for any additional or new information about Harry. To my great surprise, I found that someone had put Harry's name on the Guelph cenotaph. How was this possible? Harry had no remaining family. Who would have known him and gone to such great lengths to honor his memory and service to Canada? I did some digging and ended up contacting a woman named Karen Hunter. She told me that her late father Gil had written about Harry in his memoirs. This was the very same Gil Hunter who had answered my ad in 2005. Karen had taken it upon herself to make sure Harry was properly remembered. She had not been able to track down any of his relatives, and I think she was as surprised as I was that I had contacted her. Karen told me about a trip she was organizing, commemorating and memorializing the liberation of Holland by Canadian forces in the spring of 1945, called In Our Father's Footsteps. It sounded almost too good to be true. The trip was delayed for 2 years due to COVID. It finally went ahead in September 2022. My wife and I, along with my brother who lives in Jerusalem, Israel, attended. The trip brought together a diverse group of 90 Canadians who had one thing in common. We all had relatives who had fought on Dutch soil. We were accompanied by a friendly group of high-ranking Dutch military veterans who provided historical background while navigating us through the forests, fields, and open countryside that Canadian forces had traversed, often under fire from the Nazi forces hiding in the woods. Whenever we entered a Dutch town or village that had been liberated by Canadian forces, people lined the streets waving Canadian flags. Most were second or third generation from the war, yet still amazed that more than 75 years ago, Canadian soldiers had come from across the world to free them from 5 years of Nazi occupation. As we approached the village of Etten, the flags of Canada and the Netherlands, which had been attached to the main windmill, flapped in the breeze. It seemed like the entire population had come out to greet us. We were serenaded by 4 choirs spread out across the downtown area. We mingled with the residents, who repeatedly thanked us for making the trek. On September 11th, the group held a special ceremony in a meadow near the town of Zutphen, where 11 Canadian soldiers, including Harry, had been temporarily buried. The organizers had placed 10 crosses and 1 Magen David in the ground, along with pictures of the soldiers who had been buried there. There was a house next to the meadow. We were told that the little girl who lived there had placed a flower on each grave every day on her way to school. Incredibly, Antje van Geitenbeek, now in her 90s, still lives in the very same house. Although wheelchair-bound, she participated in the ceremony. The organizers had prepared 11 bouquets of flowers, which she handed one by one to her grandchildren, who placed them next to the markers. My brother and I then gave prepared speeches sharing what we had discovered about Harry. We also had an opportunity to visit the Isle River crossing where Harry was killed. The Walters family hosted our entire group. It was somewhat surreal, 77 years later, to be standing next to Johan, my brother, and Karen Hunter in the exact spot where Harry died. A few days later, we visited the military ceremony at Halton. It is enormous, housing almost 1,400 graves of Canadian soldiers. The grounds are beautifully maintained, but it's hard to digest the endless rows of gravestones, each marking a young man who did not make it home. My brother was asked to recite a Jewish prayer, which he modified for all of the Canadian soldiers who had died to free the world of the Nazis. To make the ceremony even more meaningful, we had brought Harry's prayer book, which had been sent back to the family with his personal effects after he had been killed. My brother held it while saying the prayer. Following the ceremony, as the group fanned out across the cemetery, we made our way to Harry's grave. In one of his letters, he wrote about hoping to visit Palestine after the war. Since he never made it, my brother brought some earthen stones from Jerusalem to place on his grave. My wife Risa and I also brought stones from Canada to place on his tombstone, so he had a bit of both homes to signify our visit. Our trip wrapped up with a visit to Apeldoorn, home to the palace of Princess Marguerite, who was born in Canada in 1943 after her family fled the Nazi occupation. She hosted us for a ceremony in a large courtyard, where she spoke quite warmly, then hosted us for high tea. After 9 days, it was time to head home. The trip had been both enlightening and meaningful on many levels. I was fortunate enough to have been left this wonderful legacy of Harry's life. To have been able to put it all together over the years, and to finally honor him among the relatives of those he served with, is a gift that I am extremely grateful for. I want to share with you some final photographs created by my daughter Carly, who is an artist. I think these images say so much more than words can express. For all of you who are the future of this amazing country, it is very important that you maintain and honor the memory of the soldiers who served so bravely in the First and Second World Wars and fought for the freedom that so many of us here take for granted. I wish all of you the best, and thank you again for having me here.